So hello everyone, this is Puy Hamami from Edison Group, and today I am with Dr. Steven Gourlay, Managing Director and CEO of Actinogen Medical. Thank you again for joining us today, Steven, and providing us with the latest updates on the company's progress.
Great to be with you, Puy. Thank you.
Thank you. So Steven, please provide us a quick reminder of how Xanamem works and on its mechanism of action, its mechanism of action targeting cortisol differs from other approaches used to slow the progression of Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, so Xanamem is a unique molecule in that it inhibits the synthesis of cortisol in tissues, but leaves the synthesis of cortisol by your adrenal gland intact for your normal stress response. And that's very important for safety, of course. And so cortisol is known to be pro-inflammatory in the brain. And this is the first molecule of its type that's ever been able to get into the brain, adequately inhibit the target, which is the enzyme synthesizing the cortisol in brain tissue, particularly areas concerned with the ability to think, like the hippocampus and frontal cortex. And so it's a unique molecule. And in fact, very recently, the World Health Organization gave the molecule its first official name, if you like. It's called an INN name, recognizing the unique nature of its ability to inhibit this enzyme called 11-beta-HSD1. And the new name is called Emestedastat, which I know is a difficult one to pronounce, but it also recognizes that this is the first and only molecule of its type to achieve that status of that INN name.
Okay. So how is Emestedastat used differently then compared to the recently approved drugs for Alzheimer's disease, such as the anti-amyloid biologic drugs such as Leqembi, Kinsula?
Exactly. So a great question. So our molecule is a once-a-day oral pill. So that's its first big difference. Those drugs you just described, the approved antibodies, target the protein that typifies Alzheimer's disease called amyloid. And there are some new ones called targeting tau, which don't seem to be working very well. But these infusions every 2 or 4 weeks of the amyloid antibodies are essentially sort of mopping up the oil spill after the tanker has spilt the oil in the ocean. What we're doing is targeting what we believe is a basic causal part of the biology of Alzheimer's disease, that being neuroinflammation and mishandling of proteins, lipids, and perhaps glucose in the brain and in the neurons. And so we're targeting an upstream, what we hope is a real causative mechanism. And by doing that, prevent the downstream deposition of amyloid and all the other toxic things associated with Alzheimer's disease.
So how do you see the Emestedastat drug fitting in clinical use settings if it becomes approved? Do you anticipate that it could be used potentially in combination with the other approved drugs for Alzheimer's disease, or perhaps as a standalone or monotherapy?
If the new clinical trial called XanaMIA confirms that we have a big clinical effect, in our pilot data, it was nearly 5 times better than the amyloid antibodies over a very short period of time. If those data are confirmed, it's very likely that an easy-to-use once-a-day pill like Xanamem, like Emestedastat, will be used as first-line therapy. However, we know that from the pharmacology work we've done, that the drug can be easily combined with other small molecules, other pills or capsules, and certainly combined with the amyloid antibodies. So most chronic diseases are treated with a combination of therapies. For example, blood pressure is commonly, you would use 2 different pills for that. And so that may well be the future. But if we are actually treating the upstream biologic mechanism that's important in Alzheimer's disease, using it as first-line monotherapy or alone may well be the best way to use it.
Mm-hmm. And I think you highlighted this. So effectively, the company has been making progress with an ongoing pivotal 220-patient Phase IIb/3 XanaMIA study in Alzheimer's disease, which started enrollment, I think, about a year ago. Please remind us on how this prospective study is designed and why you're using a blood biomarker to qualify patients.
So this study is was our first, what we call pivotal study, and that means that we anticipate that it could be used likely as one of two pivotal studies for approval in the US, Australia, and elsewhere around the world. It's a 220 patient study, meaning 110 patients will receive active Emestedastat drug, and 110 will get matching placebo. Nobody knows which is which, neither the doctors, the company, or the patients. And this is a very important standard design for pivotal prospective registrational studies. The patients are qualified with a blood test called p-tau181. Importantly, this blood test is a much easier and simpler way to confirm that patients have real Alzheimer's disease and that they likely have fairly progressive disease, which means they're suitable for study in a 9-month trial. And because the patients are treated for 36 weeks and then followed up for another 4 weeks in this trial. And so basically these patients are seen by the clinic fairly often. Many different things are measured, including their overall abilities to function and think, and those are measured using standard, well-accepted scales used by other companies, the FDA and other regulators.
Mm-hmm. And so what evidence do you have to support this design that's been chosen for the XanaMIA Phase IIb study?
So yes, we were lucky enough to be able to use the first Phase II study we did with Xanamem, which was a shorter 12-week study, which showed that in the patients with elevated p-tau181 who had much more rapid progression than those with low levels of that biomarker, we saw a very big clinical effect on an endpoint called the CDR sum of boxes. That endpoint has been used by the FDA and various companies and is well accepted as really the world standard, a regulatory endpoint for assessing the mixture of how well you're functioning and thinking, and you can measure progression over a period of months or years using that endpoint and use that as a basis for a regulatory approval. So as I mentioned earlier in the interview, had pilot data, albeit with a 34 patients, so a smallish sample, showed a very dramatic effect, 5 to 8 times better than the amyloid antibodies in a very short period of time, just 12 weeks. Now, if our data in the 9-month study are anything near as good as the pilot data, this would be a very dramatic finding, and some people would call that the holy grail, at least the best holy grail we've found so far.
So how will the XanaMIA Phase IIb/Phase III study provide any insight as to whether Emestedastat can actually have a disease-modifying effect, that is, to change the course of the disease itself?
Yes, so the endpoints we're using are very standard, well-proven endpoints to measure disease modification as used by the amyloid antibody companies and other investigators and the regulators like the FDA. So primary endpoint for the study is the CDR sum of boxes, the endpoint we saw a very big effect on in our pilot data. So that gives us a lot of confidence that we will see good positive results in this study. But in addition, we are measuring the ability to think with a lot of standardized cognitive tests, also well proven, and a well-validated modern method of assessing the ability to do standard activities of daily living, like use your smartphone or an ATM, things like that. So we are giving patients a very well-rounded assessment of all of their abilities to not just think, but also function. And if we see a slowing of progression in those endpoints, that basically is proving that we are delaying certainly progression in the disease. And in later studies, we most likely will also do serial images such as MRI to show that we're delaying shrinkage in key areas of the brain like the hippocampus associated with the ability to think.
So a lot of interesting data that could come out of this study. And so how is enrollment proceeding thus far?
Yeah, so enrollment, as is usual in these studies, starts off slow as the sites get used to the protocol and start coming online, and is accelerating. So we're currently accelerating with a number of new sites in the USA, as well as our 15 Australian sites. We have approximately 40 enrolled at this stage, and anticipate having a big step up in enrollment with the US sites all online in the next few months. Anticipate having interim data from an interim analysis when the first 100 patients reach 6 months, and that's scheduled for the third quarter of this year. And final results for the study will be in the second half of calendar year 2026.
So you mentioned the interim data, which will be, I think you mentioned in the third quarter, which appears to be a very significant potential catalyst for the company. Now, if these interim results are positive, what would this mean in terms of the drug's validation as a potential innovative treatment for Alzheimer's disease? And do you envision that licensing or tangible value realization opportunities may then be realized for shareholders?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. Firstly, the interim analyses in these types of studies need to be constructed and designed very, very carefully, because you don't want to essentially have the FDA say, no, you cheated, and looked at the results halfway through without taking these appropriate statistical penalties. So we're currently designing the interim analysis. Nevertheless, the safety reviews involved in the interim analysis and the assessment of efficacy to make sure that the study has a good chance or a reasonable chance of success, all of that's very, very positive. That said, really, the discussion with potential partners has been ongoing, for some time, and continues to be ongoing. They're very, very interested in the progress with the study, and as the final results and the interim results get closer, these companies are obviously going to be paying more and more attention, because we have positive data in major depressive disorder from our recent phase 2 study. We really feel that we've clinically validated the cortisol hypothesis, the Xanamem mechanism, and the 10 milligram dose that we're using. And as a result, we are getting a lot of interest in this program, because really now in late stage trials with a pivotal Alzheimer's trial ongoing, validating depression data, this is a very different stage compared to the company, before the major depression data came out. So we never really comment on the timing of potential partner interactions, because that's always a little bit out of our control. But those discussions are ongoing, and there's a great deal of interest in what we're doing.
That sounds very exciting. I mean, and also on the financing side, the company has completed an $11 million capital raise last fall. Does this funding allow Actinogen to reach the second half 2026 timeline for top-line final results from this study without additional financing requirement? And if so, how important is it, for the company to have this sort of flexibility?
Yes. So over the last 18 months or so, we did raise about $30 million from our shareholders, for which we are, and new investors, for which we're very grateful. Essential, obviously, when we're doing clinical trial work. We also received generous tax credits from the Australian government. The last one was $9 million in November. So in total, I think that comes up in the last 2 years to about $44 million Australian in funding, which is the right amount of money for what we need. We're not currently raising money, and we do have a cash runway to the second half of 2026. We have additional monies coming in from future tax credits, and we also have some options that unlisted options that may be exercised, and that may bring in extra revenue. And of course, if we do a deal, an upfront payment and ongoing co-development expense payments will also supplement our finances. So financially, we're in a very good position, and we thank our shareholders again for their support, and are very pleased that we've got such a healthy runway.
And now this is the first phase 3 for Alzheimer's for the drug. As a second and likely larger phase 3 in Alzheimer's disease is likely required prior to marketing registration in the major markets such as the United States, Europe, Australia, what is your current thinking for the timing and preparation for such a confirmatory phase 3 study?
Yeah, so we will be having discussions naturally with the FDA about that, and so we will We will, of course, be talking to them with positive data from our current trial about breakthrough therapy and about potential accelerated approval pathways. Again, if this drug is really 5 times better than an amyloid antibody, and it has excellent safety, of course, that would be a situation where regulators would be under a lot of pressure to allow the drug to get to patients earlier. So exactly how that will all work will very much depend on the data and on the attitude of the different regulators. And of course, in America now, we also have some changing politics around health and FDA regulation, which we don't really understand yet. So it's too early to say when the second pivotal trial would start. If the interim results are positive as we expect, and particularly if we have a partnership where the partner would like to start the phase 3 earlier, we could easily start that phase 3 before getting the final results of this current study.
Now, this Alzheimer's disease has been such a strong indication for the company, but we should also note that Actinogen also reported promising data last year from the Phase IIa XanaCIDD study in patients with major depressive disorder. What have you learned from the study about the drug's ability to treat depression and cognitive impairment in this relatively younger population compared to prior Alzheimer's disease studies?
Yeah, so first of all, there's a few things here. So the scientific rationale for treating depression with a cortisol control drug, very, very strong. And indeed, our data showing a clinically and sometimes statistically significant benefit to improve depression symptoms just confirms everything that in the previous scientific literature. So it was a very big and important scientific finding. But importantly for patients, there's still a real need for a safe antidepressant drug that can be taken without fear of withdrawal syndrome if you suddenly stop it, and can be safely combined with other drugs. And we saw quite a big effect, particularly in patients taking a regular background antidepressant called an SSRI. And so that's a great example of how Xanamem can be safely combined with other relatively powerful drugs to help patients. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, seeing a positive effect on a clinical syndrome like depression symptoms shows the drug is getting into the brain. It is targeting cortisol with its action, and that action is then causing clinical benefit. And so this is really in a big prospective clinical trial, this really does validate the drug, the program, and it also has some read through because it's validating the dose and the drug's mechanism to Alzheimer's disease as well. So basically, the whole program is very, very validating. It also is strong enough to move forward to develop Xanamem as an antidepressant, and that's something we're looking to do after discussions with the FDA and potential partners.
And so if I understand correctly, the next steps for the Emestedastat depression program has to do with discussions with the regulators?
Yes. Yep. We're planning to talk to the FDA and discuss essentially all of the elements of the depression program required to get the drug approved. And while we're doing that, as we always do, we have ongoing discussions with various stakeholders, including potential granting bodies, other pharmaceutical partners, and others who are interested in getting a new, safer antidepressant to market.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier, going back to the Alzheimer's program, that this could potentially be the holy grail for Alzheimer's disease, given that it's an oral drug with very good safety profile thus far. In brief, who do you see as the potential major competitors for oral Alzheimer's disease drugs, in that potential holy grail landscape?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because there are none, really. There are existing Alzheimer's drugs called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, and they've been around since the 90s. They essentially sort of rev up the brain's cognitive ability sort of temporarily for a few months, but they're not really regarded as disease modifying. There are some potential oral molecules in clinical trials that might be approved in the next few years. Interestingly, the Ozempic family, GLP-1 drugs, are being tested for Alzheimer's disease. They have some encouraging data to prevent Alzheimer's in patients with diabetes who've been treated, but it's too early to say whether or not a big general trial in the patient, in a broad patient population will be positive. But those data are due to read out in late 2025. Because those drugs have quite significant gastrointestinal toxicities and weight loss, of course,
Right.
not really a highly suitable category for most Alzheimer's patients who are losing weight and probably shouldn't be losing any more. But they are a potential group of molecules that could be competitors. But that's pretty much it. There's one called Anavex. Anavex is a company that has a drug that they've applied for European approval. They claim they had a positive Phase IIb study, which was a bit confusing to interpret in its design. But we'll just have to see how the regulators look at that program.
Right. Yeah. So altogether, obviously, Emestedastat has a very direct focus on the Alzheimer's indication, and so I guess looking at the whole profile, in addition to the interim XanaMIA Phase III data expected later this year, what are some of the major catalysts for Emestedastat and Actinogen that we should expect to hear from over the next year or so?
Yeah, so now that the company is in late-stage clinical trials with a very well-established safety record in more than 400 patients treated, we're really stepping up our commercial planning, our regulatory planning, and moving towards our future marketing approvals for the drug, likely in partnership with one or more pharmaceutical companies in other regions of the world, as we're an Australian company with a global operation. But the intent is to find the right partners to make this program go faster and broader, and bring it to patients as quickly as we can. So we're doing a lot of peer-reviewed publications, doing a lot of regulatory interactions. There's lots of partnership interactions. Hopefully, at some stage during the year, we would be able to announce a partnership, but that depends on obviously the timing of those interactions and ongoing discussions. We also have the interim analysis, as I mentioned, in the third quarter. We may well have the start of the next depression trial, and a number of attendances at scientific meetings and so forth. So it's a busy time for us. It's an exciting time as we interact with various thought leaders in Alzheimer's and depression around the world, and it's certainly gaining the attention of a lot of people in the Alzheimer's world in particular, as we're one of the few companies with a good-looking late-stage small molecule that really could perhaps be the holy grail.
That's great to hear, Steven. And altogether, it looks like, as you said, a very exciting time period for Actinogen with, again, very potentially transformative milestones expected later this year with the interim data. And we look forward to speaking with you again over the coming months as we monitor the company's progress and upcoming developments. And thank you again, Steven, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
Thank you.